In the last few weeks, a story has been burning across the global media cycle like wildfire. It began quietly, in European outlets, then spread into American coverage, and soon enough, it was everywhere. The headlines all circled back to one unsettling order coming straight out of Paris. France has instructed every hospital in the country to begin preparing for the possibility of mass military casualties by March 2026. The directive is not vague. It doesn't talk in loose generalities. It spells out exactly what hospitals must prepare for: the ability to handle hundreds of wounded soldiers per day, not only French troops, but foreign military personnel as well. This has sent a ripple of anxiety through Europe and beyond. Why is France, a nation located deep in Western Europe, far from the trenches of Ukraine, suddenly mobilizing its healthcare system as if a continental war is inevitable? Why is Paris instructing hospitals to plan for translators, to stockpile supplies, to ready their wards for large-scale military trauma? The implication is not hidden. The French state seems to believe that Europe is marching, step by step, toward a major war, one far greater than the grinding conflict we've already witnessed in Ukraine. President Emmanuel Macron has been dropping hints for months. His comment about Vladimir Putin being like an ogre who must constantly devour territory wasn't just a colorful metaphor, it was a strategic warning. To Macron, Putin is not someone who will stop at Ukraine, nor someone content to freeze the front lines and declare a stalemate. He is an aggressor who needs to be contained. And in France's calculation, containment means direct confrontation sooner rather than later. But this is not just about France. Across the Channel, the United Kingdom has also been quietly preparing for something bigger. Analysts who watch London's defense policies closely have pointed out that Britain, a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a nuclear power in its own right, has been moving into war readiness mode. Whether that means deploying troops directly into Ukraine, escalating intelligence operations, or bolstering NATO's eastern flank, the signals are clear. The UK is getting ready for direct military engagement with Russia in the coming years. And the United States? That's where the picture grows even darker. In Washington, debates are shifting. For much of the Ukraine war, the American line has been relatively consistent: provide weapons, provide financial aid, provide intelligence, but avoid direct boots-on-the-ground conflict with Russia. Yet, behind closed doors, American think tanks and major outlets like Bloomberg have been crunching the numbers for a very different scenario. They have openly discussed what a NATO-Russia war would cost the United States. The number being floated is staggering, over $1.5 trillion. And that's not speculation buried in obscure reports. It's being talked about openly, as though the question is no longer if, but when. So what exactly are we looking at here? Let's pause for a second and examine the timeline. France's order to its hospitals sets a clear deadline: March 2026. That doesn't mean war will break out on that exact date, but it does mean that France expects by then, hospitals across the nation must be ready to admit foreign soldiers in large numbers. That's not the kind of preparation you make for maybe. That's the kind of preparation you make when you have intelligence suggesting that the probability of conflict is high enough to justify national mobilization. Skeptics might say this is just precaution, that it's nothing more than NATO nations preparing for the worst-case scenario. But let's be honest, governments don't spend billions of dollars and rewire entire hospital systems on what if. They don't demand readiness for hundreds of battlefield casualties per day just for the sake of paperwork. When a Western nation begins issuing wartime directives to its civilian healthcare infrastructure, it's because someone at the very top believes there's a real chance of war. And where would that war erupt? The most obvious flashpoint is Eastern Europe. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all NATO members, all small, and all directly in Russia's shadow, remain vulnerable. Poland, too, is perched on the edge of the Ukraine conflict and has already become a logistical hub for Western weapons. If Russia chooses to escalate, or if NATO decides that simply holding the line in Ukraine is no longer enough, these are the countries that would find themselves at the epicenter. A single strike on a NATO member would trigger Article 5, and suddenly, this wouldn't just be about Ukraine anymore, it would be NATO versus Russia, directly. Now, Add the United States into that equation. Washington has been the backbone of NATO for decades. If France and the UK are preparing for war, then it is inconceivable that America isn't also game planning for the same outcome. In fact, it's the United States that would bear the heaviest burden, not just financially, but militarily. American troops would be deployed, American logistics networks would be stretched, and American cities would be debating whether the homeland itself might be targeted if things spiraled out of control. This is where the controversy deepens. Some argue that all of this is little more than theater, that Western leaders are exaggerating the threat to justify higher defense budgets, to condition the public into accepting the idea of war. But others insist that what's happening now is far too coordinated, far too specific to be dismissed as political gamesmanship. France's hospital order is not for show. The UK's military posturing is not for headlines. The US calculating the trillion-dollar price tag of a NATO war is not a think tank exercise to fill column inches. These are preparations, serious ones, and serious preparations usually mean serious expectations. So, what is the truth? Are we really watching the opening act of World War III? Or is this just a psychological operation, a way for Western governments to pressure Russia into backing down? That's the chilling uncertainty. Because history teaches us something uncomfortable. When great powers begin to mobilize, even if their intent is deterrence, the act of mobilization itself often accelerates the path to conflict. Once armies are prepared, once hospitals are ready, once industries have shifted into wartime footing, the momentum can become unstoppable. The French order specifically included language interpreters for foreign soldiers. Think about that detail. That means Paris isn't just imagining its own troops being wounded. It's imagining Polish soldiers, Lithuanian soldiers, maybe even Americans being rushed into French hospitals. That paints a picture of war on such a scale that Western Europe itself would be overwhelmed with casualties. This is not about limited skirmishes in Donbass. This is about a scenario where NATO soldiers by the thousands are being injured day after day. And while Europe steels itself, the United States finds itself trapped in a dilemma it cannot escape. On one hand, Washington cannot allow Russia to expand unchecked. On the other, a full-scale NATO-Russia war would be a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Yet the gears are turning. The think tanks are writing. The budgets are being calculated. The hospitals are being ordered to prepare. Step by step, the West is moving toward a war that nobody publicly admits they want, yet privately, many seem to be expecting. It's worth asking, do France, the UK, and the United States know something that the public doesn't? Has intelligence already confirmed that Putin intends to strike beyond Ukraine? Or is this about something subtler, the recognition that the longer the Ukraine war drags on, the more likely it is to spill across borders, whether intentionally or by accident? A missile lands in the wrong place, a NATO convoy is targeted, a cyber attack spirals out of control, and suddenly, Article 5 is on the table. That's the shadow hanging over Europe now. A war that may not be inevitable, but is increasingly being treated as though it is. And France's hospitals, ordinary civilian institutions, are being transformed into the front lines of that preparation. Imagine being a French doctor or nurse reading that directive. One day you're treating flu cases and car accidents, and the next you're told, get ready for hundreds of wounded soldiers, speaking languages you may not even understand, bleeding out in your ER every single day. That's not just preparation, that's psychological conditioning for a nation. And that brings us to the uncomfortable conclusion. Either this is the largest scale bluff in modern geopolitics, or it is the sober acceptance that by 2026, NATO and Russia will be at war. There isn't much middle ground left. The West doesn't prepare hospitals for